Chapter 2 is a review of neuroanatomy. So this should be a review from your anatomy and physiology class. And we're not going to go into great detail on this because as we talk about each system, we will discuss the detail of the anatomy of that system. But what I want you to get out of this chapter is I want you to get the information you need to do the first homework assignment, which is filling out the brain and nervous system function chart. So, of course, you don't have to write a novel in each one of those sections. It's just a chart. A bulleted list would be fine. Just basic function of that individual area of the brain or nervous system. And really, this is intended to be a review. So, just like in kinesiology when we were talking about anatomical position and the cardinal planes, those same planes are used to describe the nervous system. So they're the imaginary lines through the nervous system. Sagittal plane divides the system into right and left portions. Horizontal plane into top and bottom halves. And the coronal or frontal plane into anterior and posterior portions. So when we're talking about the relationship of different structures to one another, we use the same anatomical terms that we used in anatomy and physiology. So nothing new here, just a review. So when visually, when we look at cross-sections of the brain and the nervous system, we see gray and white matter. So they are the visible cellular distinctions in the central nervous system. Gray matter areas of the central nervous system primarily contain neuron cell bodies and dendrites. Information is integrated in the gray matter. White matter contains axons and myelin. So axons are the projections of nerve cells that usually convey information away from the cell body. And we'll talk about this in a lot more detail in Chapter 6. Axons convey information among parts of the nervous system. Myelin consists of cells that insulate the electrical conduction of axons. So areas with a large proportion of myelin appear white because of the high fat content of myelin. So if you look at the study objectives, which I'm sure you already looked at before you listened to this, we said why is white matter white and gray matter gray? And the answer is that white matter contains high proportions of myelin, which has a high fat content, and that's why it shows up as white. So bundles of myelinated axons that travel together in the central nervous system are usually called tracts. 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 There are other names for a tract, namely a lemniscus, fasciculus, column, peduncle, or a capsule. And so when we're talking about the individual areas and their different structures, you will hear those different terms used to describe bundles of myelinated axons that travel together. And we'll name the different tracts. So the nervous system is divided into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system in the diagram here, it's everything outside of the dotted line in the diagram. So that dotted line indicates the transition from the central nervous system to the peripheral nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system consists of two different functional groups of axons. Afferent axons, which carry information toward the central nervous system. For example, a sensory neuron has an afferent axon that transmits the information to the central nervous system when you touch something with your hand or when something touches you. Efferent axons carry information away from the central nervous system. So they carry motor commands from the central nervous system to skeletal muscles. So obviously the afferent and the efferent axons work together to we get information from the outside world and we act upon it. So the afferent axons bring the information from the outside world to the CNS, and the CNS uses efferent axons to enact whatever actions we're going to take on the outside world. So there are peripheral components of the somatic nervous system. So if we further divide the peripheral nervous system into the somatic and the autonomic nervous system. So the somatic nervous system is all the sensory and motor system that we use in the periphery, and the autonomic nervous system is the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, and we'll talk about all of these in vivid detail. The peripheral components of the somatic nervous system include axons, sensory nerve endings, and glial cells. And glial cells are the support cells of the nervous system, like Schwann cells and other ones that we will talk about individually. Peripheral components of the autonomic nervous system often include entire neurons, including the cell body and the axon, sensory endings, synapses, ganglia, which are groups of neurons, and glia, again, those glial cells, those are our support cells. So the central nervous system is divided into three regions: the spinal region, the brainstem and cerebellar region, and the cerebrum. So the spinal region, this is a cross-section of the spinal cord. It shows the gray matter forming that H, capital H shape in the middle, surrounded by white matter. So each side of the gray matter is subdivided into dorsal, lateral, and ventral horns. Dorsal and ventral correspond to posterior and anterior, so the dorsal horns are posterior, the ventral horns are anterior, and the lateral horns, of course, are lateral. So it's those cell bodies in the gray matter surrounded by the bundles of axons in the white matter. The cross-section of the spinal cord that shows that letter H has the divisions of the we have the divisions of the gray matter, and we'll talk about the functional significance of all that. The dorsal horn of the spinal cord we talked about a little bit in last quarter in 111. We were talking about gating theory and how modality stimulating those A beta fibers goes up and blocks pain signals in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. Here we go. We're getting there to the dorsal horn. So we will talk a lot more about those anti-nociception properties and several different levels of anti-nociception in the nervous system. So the dorsal horn contains cell bodies of motor neurons, interneurons, and the sensory endings of sensory neurons. So lots going on in the spinal region. So the spinal region itself has two main functions. Within the spinal cord, there are the necessary circuits to orchestrate movement. So the spinal region conveys information between the neurons innervating peripheral structures and the brain. And information is also processed in the spinal region. So I'm sure in anatomy and physiology you talked about reflex arcs, those reflexive movements of a limb away from a painful stimulus. All of the processing goes on in the spinal cord. It does not have to go up to the brain to get that. So the spinal region conveys somatosensory information to the brain and conveys signals from the brain to the neurons that directly control movement. There are some interneurons, which are in between the afferent and the efferent, that help process that information. So a lot going on in the spinal region. The brainstem, there's a lot going on in the brainstem too. So there are lots of fiber tracts carrying motor and sensory information through the brainstem, and other fiber tracts that begin or end within the brainstem. So the brainstem contains important groups of neurons that control equilibrium, cardiovascular activity, respiration, and other vital functions. It's sort of shaped like a cylinder that's wider at the top. There are three parts. The upper top is the medulla, the middle is the pons, and then the midbrain. The upper part is the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla is the lower part. We will talk more specifically about the function of each different areas, but the interesting thing is how some information ends up in the medulla. We have autonomic neurons that sense chemical levels, and like the level of CO2 that might cause you to decrease or increase your respiratory rate. So a lot of the stuff that terminates in the brainstem has immediate effect on vital function. So if you have a brainstem issue, you have a big issue, because that control of vital function is very important. So cranial nerves, they emerge from the surface of the brainstem particularly, and there are 12 pairs of them. They're numbered according to the site of attachment to the brain, anterior to posterior. So the olfactory nerve, cranial nerve 1, is the most anterior, and cranial nerve 12, the hypoglossal, is the most posterior. So the cranial nerves, they can contain all sensory fibers, like the olfactory, optic, and vestibulocochlear nerve, all motor fibers, like the other ones listed there, or they could be mixed sensory and motor. So with the cranial nerves, there's a whole chapter on cranial nerves, and we are going to just touch on it. Most cranial nerves innervate structures in the head, face, and neck, with the exception of the vagus nerve, which innervates thoracic and abdominal viscera in addition to structures in the head and the neck. So we will just basically, what you'll need to know about cranial nerves eventually, not right this minute, but just be able to list all of them and their basic function. So we will not go into extreme depth on cranial nerves, but you definitely should know them. The cerebellum, it consists of 2 large cerebellar hemispheres and a midline vermis. It connects to the posterior brainstem by large bundles of fibers called peduncles. There's the superior, middle, and inferior peduncles that join the midbrain, pons, and medulla with the cerebellum. And the cerebellum's function is to coordinate movements. So it does this on an unconscious or subconscious level. We don't have to pay attention to every time the cerebellum corrects a movement for us, which is great because it's really working on our balance and our coordination. So if you've ever driven a friend home who's had a few too many drinks, then you know the function of the cerebellum. It coordinates their movements, and so you're not able to drive. So alcohol affects your cerebellum a lot. I've in the past worked with people who've had cerebellar strokes, and it is incredibly difficult for them to coordinate movement, and so of course that's what we're working on in therapy. So it's very interesting to see the effects of the cerebellum. So the cerebrum is also known as the diencephalon. It consists of 4 structures, and all 4 of those structures have the word thalamus in their name. That's how you know if something is part of the diencephalon, if it contains the word thalamus. So that's a good tip for later. The thalamus itself is a large egg-shaped collection of nuclei, neural nuclei, in the center of the cerebrum. So you see something like that that's in the very dead center of the cerebrum, which is then encased in bone and whatever. It's probably pretty important, right? Because it's in the central area. I like the analogy of the thalamus being the cerebrum's executive assistant. So the cerebrum is the CEO, and the thalamus is the executive assistant. So all of the calls that come in to the CEO, the executive assistant gets to decide what goes to the boss and what stays there. So the thalamus does not necessarily, it only passes along the information that it feels is most important for survival. So if a threat is perceived, it'll go to the cerebrum. If it's a low level, it's not considered to be a threat, you might not be consciously aware of it because the thalamus isn't going to let that call through. So the nuclei in the thalamus relay information to the cerebral cortex. They process emotion and some memory information, and integrate different types of sensation. Also, it plays a big role in regulating consciousness, arousal, and attention. So really important function in the thalamus. The hypothalamus, it's inferior to the thalamus. It maintains body temperature, metabolic rate, and chemical levels in the body, and it largely exerts its influence through hormones. So a lot of times it will send off a signal to an endocrine gland, which is then going to release a hormone, which either releases hormone directly into the bloodstream, or it exerts its effect on another gland. So the hypothalamus, it's a big player in the endocrine system. The epithalamus is posterior and superior to the thalamus. It contains the pineal gland, which influences the secretion of other endocrine glands. It's a big deal in our circadian rhythms and sleep. The pineal gland is where melatonin is produced. The subthalamus is inferior and lateral to the thalamus. It's part of a neural circuit that controls movement. So it's part of that whole cerebellar, basal ganglia, subthalamus, all of those contribute to movement control. So we have a lot of structures contributing to that because movement is important. We need to move in order to function as human beings, and so there are a lot of structures in the brain that deal with movement. And in physical therapy, movement is our bread and butter. That's what we work on in physical therapy. So the cerebrum, or cerebral hemispheres, there are two cerebral hemispheres divided by a longitudinal fissure. The surfaces of the cerebral hemispheres are marked by rounded elevations called gyri and grooves called sulci. So the singular of gyri is gyrus, and the singular of sulci is sulcus. So when you have a groove, it's a sulcus. You have a bump, it's a gyrus. And all of them together are gyri and sulci. And there are different names for them in the brain, for the individual ones. So each cerebral hemisphere is subdivided into 6 lobes. The frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital are named for the overlying bones of the skull. The limbic and insular are not clearly marked in terms of boundaries. They are located throughout the cerebrum, and so the different functions of those areas often have to do with their location, but the limbic and insular, since they're located throughout the cerebrum, actually participate in a lot of different functions. So the frontal lobe, there's a lot of decision making and personality type stuff that goes on there. The parietal lobe, a lot of the sensory and motor areas are there. The occipital lobe has vision. The temporal lobe deals with hearing and language. Very intimately connected functions. Limbic and insular lobes deal a lot with processing of emotions and arousal and attention. So a lot going on in the cerebrum. The surface of the cerebral hemispheres is called the cerebral cortex. That's where we process sensory, motor, and memory information. It is the site for reasoning, language, nonverbal communication, intelligence, and personality. So this is the area of the brain that we really consider to be our consciousness. This is where we do all of our higher thinking, higher reasoning, higher processing. So deep to the cerebral cortex we have white matter, which is composed of myelinated axons connecting the cerebral cortex with other central nervous system areas. So very important, that cerebral white matter. And we'll talk more about that in the cerebrum chapter. The corpus callosum is a huge bundle of axons that connects the right and left cerebral cortices. And we will talk more about that as well. So within the gray matter of the hemispheres, there are additional areas of gray matter. And we'll talk about these in their individual chapters as well. But the basal ganglia, there are different nuclei that make up the basal ganglia, the caudate, the putamen, the globus pallidus. You don't necessarily have to know those right now, and we'll definitely talk more of them in the basal ganglia chapter. But the basal ganglia, a ganglion is a group of neurons, and so this is a group of groups of neurons, if that makes sense. And they're involved in social and goal-oriented behavior, movement, and emotions. So those are all very important areas as human beings. So movement, well, hey, that's a big one. Social and goal-oriented behavior and emotions. The basal ganglia is the area of the brain that is affected in Parkinson's. And so it does affect all those things. Even though Parkinson's is classified as a movement disorder. There are other things that go on with it. And I think I've said to you guys before that one of the specialty areas that I work in is a Parkinson's specialty program. And it's very interesting. I love working with people with Parkinson's. There's a lot we can do for them to help them improve their function. And it's also very interesting seeing the changes in the social and goal-oriented behavior and movement, as well as emotions. So very interesting area of the brain. The amygdala is involved in emotions and motivation. There's a lot of processing that we go through with pain management and everything that emotions and motivation are highly involved in. So this comes up in therapy all the time. The hippocampus is involved in memory, but declarative memory, which is remembering facts and figures and that sort of thing, and we'll talk more about memory later in the quarter, but the declarative memory system includes the hippocampus, but it also includes the fornix and parts of the thalamus and the cerebral cortex. So memory is a very complex area, and the hippocampus is just one of the things that's involved in memory. So, of course, we have to have a support system and a fluid management system. The fluid in the brain, the cerebrospinal fluid, is a modified filtrate of plasma. The CSF circulates from cavities inside the brain to the surface of the central nervous system, and it's then reabsorbed into the venous blood system. So it lends buoyancy and brings nutrition to the areas of the brain. So that buoyancy is important. It has a cushioning effect. And the nutritive functions are important as well. So there are 4 ventricles. When you look at this picture, it shows all the 4 ventricles, and of course all these pictures are from the text. But there is a pair of lateral ventricles located inside the cerebral hemispheres. There's a 3rd ventricle that's a midline slit in the diencephalon, and a 4th ventricle located posterior to the pons and medulla and anterior to the cerebrum. So that gives us that cushioning and buoyancy effect, plus the nutritive effects. So the ventricles, the ventricular system, they continue through the medulla and spinal cord as a central canal, and it ends in the caudal spinal cord. So it goes throughout the central nervous system. The cerebrospinal fluid that is held in the ventricles is secreted by an area called the choroid plexus. So the lateral ventricles are connected to the 3rd ventricle by the interventricular foramina. The 3rd and 4th ventricles are connected by the cerebral aqueduct. The CSF leaves the 4th ventricle through the lateral foramina and the medial foramen to circulate around the CNS. It's a one-way circulation, and when we get to the support systems chapter, we will talk more about the path that the CSF takes and the importance of its function. So the meninges, they are the membranous coverings of the brain and spinal cord. There are 3 layers of it: the dura mater, the arachnoid, and the pia mater. The dura is named for its toughness, durable, dura mater. It has 2 projections that separate parts of the brain, and there's a name of them, but I don't expect you to remember those. The arachnoid is named for its resemblance to a spider web, and the pia is a very delicate membrane that adheres to the surface of the central nervous system. So the cerebrospinal fluid system regulates the contents of the extracellular fluid and provides buoyancy to the CNS by suspending the brain and spinal cord within fluid and within the meninges, within that membranous covering. So they're all kind of involved in supporting and providing nutrients to the brain and protecting it. So that's all good stuff. The blood supply to the brain is supplied by 2 pairs of arteries. the internal carotid arteries and the vertebral arteries, which the vertebral arteries are the ones that run through the transverse foramina of the cervical vertebrae. And we talked just very briefly about those in anatomy and physiology, or in kinesiology, sorry. I was jumping back. But the blood supply to the brain and cerebrum is highly important. And actually, when you have strokes and certain brain injuries, it has to do with interruption to the blood supply. So branches of the vertebral arteries and branches of the basilar arteries supply the brainstem and the cerebellum. Near the junction of the pons and medulla, the vertebral arteries join to form the basilar artery. At the junction of the pons and the midbrain, the basilar artery divides to become the posterior cerebral arteries. So there's a nifty little structure that's called the circle of Willis, and it's anastomoses of all the arteries to form a ring of all these 9 arteries to supply blood to the central hemispheres, or the cerebral hemispheres, which is pretty cool that it does that. So without anastomosis, it really provides alternate routes for the blood. So if you can't get blood to the right area, it can go another way. So those 6 large paired arteries anastomose, and there are 3 small communicating arteries. So it's sort of like a city that has a lot of main highways, and then you have these little roads going in between to provide surface streets to go on when the main highways are full. So the blood supply is very complex and really high functioning, because if you don't have blood in your brain, you don't have anything. So really super important area to consider, the blood supply to the brain. So here's our blood supply the blood is supplied to the cerebral hemispheres by 3 main cerebral arteries. The internal carotid branches into anterior and middle cerebral arteries, and the posterior cerebral artery continues to form, continues on from the circle of Willis as the 3rd major cerebral artery. We will find out later on in the blood supply chapter that middle cerebral artery strokes are by far the most common type of strokes, and they produce what we consider to be sort of the most common CVA symptoms. So it's likely having to do with the structure of that middle cerebral artery. The areas that are affected by that include areas for language and memory and movement. And so we are dealing with the repercussions of these MCA strokes a lot of times in therapy. So it's good to know the structures of those and how it affects things. So we'll go into a lot more detail on all of these different structures in their individual chapters, but this is just a short little intro. You'll fill out that brain and nervous system function chart. Once everybody has turned theirs in, I will post a key to it. So you can kind of see what, I don't know how official any of these answers are, but you can see what the official answers are. So in the next section, chapter 3, we're going to talk about evaluation and diagnosis of neurological problems and the definition of the neurological problems themselves.